Chapter 14. Sedentary Soldier. On return from Afghanistan, No. 12 Company was disbanded, and I was redeployed to the role of CQMS for No. 2 Company. These men, well, let's be fair, boys, as the majority of them were under the age of 21, were battle-hardened and a good bunch. However, we were thrown straight back into the stressful world of public duties, but not before a medal parade. This would be conducted by the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, and would be their first official military engagement as a recently married couple. I had been asked if I had wanted to participate in the royal wedding as part of the Guard of Honour, but this was during my post-operational tour leave, and I just wanted a break from all things military. In hindsight, I regret this, as it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But as a consolation, I would meet the future King and Queen when they would present us with our Afghanistan medals. To begin with, the royals were late for the parade, which was putting pressure on some of the single-leg amputees who had chosen to stand. Furthermore, many of the soldiers on parade, such as myself, were suffering from spinal and musculoskeletal injuries as a result of the horrendous weight that we had been hauling for the past 6 months in Afghanistan. Eventually they arrived, and the parade began. I was responsible for holding the tray with the medals on it for Princess Catherine, and as she presented the men with their medals, she would ask them questions about their experiences in Afghanistan. To be fair to the lads, they were all very polite and respectful. Well, that was until Prince William approached Guardsman Mane. Mane was a Commonwealth soldier from the Gambia and was on parade in a wheelchair as a result of being a triple amputee from an IED blast. We were having some military banter beforehand, but Mane would eventually have the last laugh. He had just received his medal from Princess Catherine when Prince William joined us, and the two of them engaged in casual conversation. Prince William then mentioned to Mane that if he needed any assistance, he should let him know, as he was the colonel of our regiment. To which Mane immediately replied, "When I was blown up, I had $100 in my wallet, and I never got it back from my CQMS." Prince William and Catherine both looked directly at me in disgust, and must have thought that I had stolen Mane's wallet while he was dying on the battlefield. I wasn't even his CQMS in Afghanistan. Did Mane really think that his wallet with $100 had survived an IED blast that blew his arm and legs off? Maybe this was his attempt at humour, but the future King and Queen didn't think so, and I can still feel the shameful, chilling and disappointed look they gave me, even though I'd done nothing wrong. Maybe Mane thought this would be funny, but I certainly didn't think so. In hindsight, it was obvious that many of the boys in No. 2 Company were suffering with their mental health, and they were doing what was institutionally accepted throughout the summer of 2011, and that was to get drunk. We would often turn up late for duty, and disciplinary action was rarely implemented. The command element was aware of the tough fighting that had occurred during Op Herrick 13, and this was a cooling-off period for us all. I was still suffering with my back, and was under physio conducting rehabilitation, yet despite this, I was still required to perform ceremonial duties due to manning shortages. I was still being institutionally bullied by a few bad apples from the previous generation of dinosaurs, and because my injury wasn't visible, in their eyes, it didn't exist. In that October, I finally got the MRI scan that I'd been requesting since I had originally pulled my back in Afghanistan 12 months prior. Finally, I have medical evidence that acknowledged that I was injured. I had a significant L4/5 protruding disc that was pushing on my spinal cord, and what was more important to me was that I had a copy of the MRI images to visibly show people. The battalion doctor was the only one to apologize, as he believed that I wasn't showing any medical symptoms from such a severe spinal injury due to the fact that I was still able to function in Afghanistan and continued to carry out my daily tasks, including ceremonial duties. I'd even taken part in the Trooping of the Colour, the Queen's birthday parade that year. Although I no longer desired to be deployed on operational tours, I was still institutionalized, and therefore the British Army's needs were always prioritized above my own, even if this was harmful to my own long-term physical health. I remember forwarding the images from my MRI to all of those who had insinuated that I was faking, setting a bad example, or who just blatantly called me a coward. Surprisingly, none of them ever replied. Yet I felt a satisfying sense of vindication. Part of me had believed that I may have been faking my back injury, as we were taught to follow orders, and I was indoctrinated into military culture. Therefore, if someone above me in the chain of command said that I was faking injury, I was trained to accept their military diagnosis. It soon became apparent that I would require surgery, and at this point, it became clear that I was no longer useful to the Army, as I was considered non-deployable on future operations. There are limited uses for a senior non-commissioned officer in an infantry fighting unit, so I was sent back to Manchester in the January of 2012 as a recruiting colour sergeant, and informed that I should use the time there to try and regain my full fitness. In 2012, the country was currently bankrupt as a result of the expensive, prolonged conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, and all areas of public services were being cut, including the armed forces. Redundancies were being offered initially to the civil servants at the Ministry of Defence, with the average payoff being in the region of £30,000. Unfortunately, this immediately impacted the civil servants at the Army Careers Office in Manchester, as the clerical support staff would be reduced by 50%. And even the office manager, a long-standing warrant officer, had been given his marching orders. This would leave myself and a staff sergeant from the REME to pick up the pieces. He would run the administrational side, and I would be responsible for the operational running of the Greater Manchester region, which also included 5 smaller officers. I was now the boss of some of the same sergeants who I had known from my previous posting there. But now, I wasn't even invited out on Friday drinks, which kind of hurt. Like the rest of the British Army, we were expected to keep up our same productivity with less manpower and resources. For the sergeants in the recruiting environment, this meant weekend duties, which was not a popular decision, and excluded me from all social gatherings. Ouch. The Careers Office was the ideal place for me to recover from my injury, as I had bought a house there before Op Herrick 13 and had married Jane on my return from Afghanistan. I had delayed my proposal until I had returned safely. Soldiers are superstitious, since it always seemed to be the ones with the most to lose who were, more often than not, killed in action. I'd always segregated Jane from Army life, and was adamant that I never wanted her to live in Army quarters due to the constant moving around, which provided very little stability for her or any future family. The only positive of this posting was that it was the ideal opportunity to audition as a happy family in normal civilian life. And I soon realized how lucky I was despite my agonizing back injury. Yet the Army was still my priority, and I was convinced that I would make a full recovery. Therefore, I was determined to make good use of my time as the office manager, to put my back injury behind me, and return to my battalion as a potential warrant officer. Once settled into my new job, I was quickly referred to an orthopaedic surgeon in Teesside, as this was the nearest military facility, and I was fast-tracked for a discectomy on my bulging disc in the March of 2012. My surgeon was overly confident and had convinced me that I would be running again in 3 months, which was reassuring and welcome news. The L4/5 nerve root in my spine had suffered damage, and this was affecting my lower left leg. And this operation was 18 months after the initial injury had been sustained in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, I would fall into the category of 10% of discectomies where they immediately reprolapse, which I fundamentally believe was due to my initial aftercare. The day after my spinal injury, I was informed that the operation had been a success, and I was discharged. I then had to wait for a military driver to collect me from Manchester and was placed in an uncomfortable upright chair for 3 hours whilst I waited. Then I had to undertake the painful 2-hour drive back home to my house for a few weeks of bed rest before gradually returning to my sedentary duties in the careers office. Later that year, I received a personal injury claim for £10,000 from the Armed Forces Compensation Scheme, and this was welcomed, as I had spent all of my savings from Afghanistan on my wedding to Jane in Las Vegas. This compensation seemed fair, as at the time I was convinced that I was going to make a full recovery and return to fitness. After the surgery, I was optimistic, and I planned for my next promotion. I desperately wanted to be the company Sergeant Major of No. 4 Company, and this was easily achievable, as I was a colour sergeant with a maximum of 8 years left on my contract, 6 if I wanted to be pensioned off early. I was ticking all of the right boxes for promotion to Warrant Officer Class 2. I had completed an operational tour as a CQMS. I had conducted a unit move, and now I had a strong external report, which would further support my recommendations for promotion. The only thing that was holding me back was my medical fitness. Subconsciously, I secretly knew that the operation had not been a success, as I was still in a lot of pain. However, I have always been able to tolerate pain, but I was still unable to run. This was a combination of my weak left leg and the increased pain from the impact of running, which is why I bought a cross-trainer exercise machine for my home. This allowed me to maintain my fitness levels without the added pain of impact exercise, and I was still fit, despite the lack of running. However, my 2-year recovery posting would be cut short when I received a phone call from Wade informing me that I was being recalled to my battalion to replace him as both the welfare and the recruiting officer, despite not holding the rank of warrant officer or captain. I was disappointed, as Jane was pregnant with our first child, and I had hoped to be around for the full pregnancy. And now I was going to be married unaccompanied in Aldershot, 230 miles away. This did present a career opportunity, though, as in the past we have had both a welfare warrant officer and a recruiting warrant officer, and if I was doing both these jobs, then I would almost guarantee my next promotion. So, rather than prioritizing my family and the birth of my first child, I had selfishly prioritized my own needs, which of course were the same as the British Army's above all else. When you are consumed within the military bubble, it is quite easy to justify putting the army before your family, as the rest of your colleagues are doing the exact same thing. I thought that through promotion I could please everyone, as I would provide financial rewards for my family, as well as recognition from my military masters, from whom I still sought approval. I had convinced myself that the ends justify the means, and that I was fulfilling the British Army's needs as well as my own egotistical ones. I was selfless. I remember that Jane was naturally disappointed that I was called back to my battalion after just 12 months. But I was a soldier, and, as such, followed orders. Besides, I was terrified of being made redundant, and didn't want to make any waves as we had a baby on the way, and I needed job security. I would be taking over from Wade, and was looking forward to seeing him. But he was a shadow of his former self, and it didn't take long to understand why. He'd been the welfare officer for the Irish Guards on Op Herrick 13, and this had, in no uncertain terms, broken him. He had been responsible for the aftercare of the injured soldiers and the amputees, and let's not forget that he had to link up with the families of those killed at the hands of the Taliban. This was made even more difficult due to the fact that Wade often had a personal relationship with many of these soldiers and their families. He had in-depth battlefield experience from his deployment to Northern Ireland, Kosovo, and Iraq, and was an excellent career soldier who had gone from recruit to the rank of captain. But his welfare support role had taken its toll and reduced him to an unrecognizable shell of his former self. Wade could no longer provide welfare support for the families and soldiers of the Irish Guards, especially as 2 Company were due to deploy back to Afghanistan. He was emotionally exhausted. Number 2 Company were training to deploy to Afghanistan in the coming months, and Wade could not tolerate the emotional burden of providing welfare support for the pending deployment. Wade would take me to the recovery and rehabilitation wards at Headley Court, and it was no surprise that everyone knew him. He even drove me to Birmingham to walk me through the 24-hour casualty evacuation procedure from the time of the incident in Afghanistan to the injured soldiers arriving at the Queen Elizabeth II Hospital. As always, Wade was thorough and professional, and I remember how difficult this was for him, as all that he had from these locations were bad memories. It was upsetting to see Wade like this, and I'm still disappointed that he didn't even receive a medal or any recognition for the important job that he did, as he was very much a part of Op Herrick 13. Wade would leave the regular army shortly afterwards, but would return on a short engagement detached from the Irish Guards at a local personal recovery unit close to his family home. He would essentially be a civilian in a uniform under a 12-month renewable contract, but he would keep his rank and identity, and this is a path that many of my brethren would follow. Some would join the Army Reserves in a desperate attempt to hold on to their military identity, as, after 2 decades of service, you can often become the uniform. It defines you and is hard to let go of. Bearing in mind that most career soldiers like myself were recruited as teenagers and had only known military life as adults, this may explain why detaching themselves from their military identity is so difficult. However, I was only concerned about my next promotion, and was thriving in my dual role despite the added pressure. But my physical health was suffering as a result. Most weekends, I would be stuck in the Friday rush hour traffic heading home, and, on one occasion, this took me 9 hours. These long weekly drives were also harmful to my ongoing back issues, and I was having a combination of steroid and facet joint injections in my spine to keep me going. The recruitment side was easy, and I formulated a completely fresh new marketing strategy for the Irish Guards that was aimed at the civilian sector and incorporated the use of social media. For some strange reason, the traditional regimental marketing campaigns of the past had been targeted at the current military audience, which made no sense to me as they were already recruited. The welfare side was more complex, as I was dealing with some very multifaceted and personal issues. On my unit welfare officer's course, I was taught that the Army's needs were always the priority, followed closely by the soldiers, then their families. And this was evident within the battalion. I would witness company sergeant majors blatantly ignoring young soldiers' injuries, and I even witnessed one company sergeant major ordering a soldier who was on crutches to deploy on a tactical exercise. Soldiers with drink-related issues couldn't hide anymore due to the added manning pressures of the redundancies. and the accepted drinking culture, especially within the sergeant's mess, was gradually weeded out. These reduced levels of manning made all our jobs incredibly difficult, with some, like me, having 2 roles, and this left little time for the welfare of the soldiers. This would result in the slightest issues being raised to my office, whereas welfare was every commander's responsibility. Yet, this had somehow been forgotten due to the busy schedule, reduced manning, and the high tempo of battalion life. I remember that when my wife went into labour, I immediately downed tools and drove to Manchester in record time, overtaking a 1985 DeLorean on the way. Thankfully, Jane's waters had broken on a midweek evening, and I was able to arrive back home in sufficient time to witness the birth of my daughter. When Mara was born, I was completely overwhelmed and emotionally compromised and began to cry tears of happiness. All of my years of suppressed anger, trauma, and emotion were suddenly released. The birth of my daughter would change my whole outlook, as my loyalty was no longer to the British Army, but to my family. However, I was still working from home on my paternity leave. In fact, I was always working on leave whilst I was the welfare officer. So my loyalty and priorities would progressively take time to switch over during the following 12 months. Maybe it was because I was no longer in combat roles, but I felt like I was becoming soft, more emotional, and maybe this was the real reason I was struggling with my back and leg pain and was subsequently sent for another MRI scan. The scan clearly showed that my L4/5 disc had popped again, and I would need further spinal surgery, this time a revised discectomy. I was snowed under with work and was killing myself because I was due for a promotion, but more importantly, I was terrified of being made redundant. I remember that on the day of the surgery I was so focused on my work that I had to be forced out of the office. Then, whilst in my hospital bed in pre-op, I was still working on the laptop and taking phone calls, and even tried to delay my operation to complete my duties. From my perspective, I would do whatever it took to salvage my career and to provide job security for my family. The operation in November 2013 initially appeared to be successful, and I was sent home for 6 weeks to recover, but with my work phone and laptop, of course. I would use what was left of 2013 to physically rest despite still working from home. The only advantage of this was that I could frequently see my good friend John, who was losing his battle with cancer. John was like a big brother to me, and was always there to guide me in times of hardship. We had similar experiences of childhood, from abusive Irish families to being the care of the state, and then had both excelled in the Irish Guards, and this helped us forge a special bond. We had served closely together in Kosovo, Northern Ireland, and Afghanistan, and it was devastating to witness him deteriorate and waste away so quickly. John was convinced that the operational stress of fighting the Taliban in Helmand province had triggered his cancer, and he was tremendously angry with the way in which he had been treated by the battalion when he had started to experience the early symptoms of this cruel illness. In hindsight, we were both failed by the medical personnel and our chain of command whilst we were deployed in Afghanistan, as their only priority was the mission, and we were disposable tools that could be cast aside once the mission was complete. Sadly, this was the unwelcome truth, as the strategic needs of operations always came before the welfare of the individual soldiers. In the weeks after returning to barracks after our tour in Afghanistan, I remember that Niall, Frank, John and I were having a meal at the local Pizza Hut when John suddenly rushed off to the toilet to throw up his dinner. We didn't know this at the time, but John was suffering from the early symptoms of esophageal cancer. I was thankful that I was posted back to Manchester after the tour, as this allowed frequent visits to see each other without the high tempo and demands of battalion life, which often meant working weekends. It was heartbreaking to witness John slowly waste away, and at his funeral, in the January of 2014, I broke down and wept uncontrollably in front of all my military brethren. Since the birth of my daughter, I was no longer that emotionless machine-like harbinger of death, and I was gradually regaining my connection to my mortality. In his dying weeks, I had continuously asked John about his preferred funeral arrangements, and he had informed me not to worry, as he had a file prepared with everything set out for me in fine detail. He'd often joked that he wanted heavy breeze blocks to be put on his coffin, so that his friends who would be coffin bearers would have to work that little bit harder. John was always the joker, and he would even get one over me from the grave, as no such file with his funeral preferences even existed. I was at his bedside supporting his wife and daughter when he passed, and this was the most emotionally charged and painful moment of my life. But I had to dig deep and suppress all my emotions for his family and help organize the funeral. John would have the last laugh as I liaised with his wife, his church, and the Irish Guards to organize his funeral, constantly asking about the whereabouts of this file. Then at the wake, one of his close civilian friends thanked me for organizing everything, and that this had been John's plan all along. Maybe John could not accept his own pending death, despite the fact that he had witnessed so much death throughout his military career. Regardless, I hope that he had a good chuckle to himself one last time, knowing that he'd done me over yet again. I found it difficult to process John's death, knowing of his battlefield exploits, and to be slowly taken by cancer seemed unfair and cruel. All of our lives are a little bit duller without him, and I miss my brother every day. After the funeral, I would return to the battalion, but I wasn't the same. With the combination of the birth of my daughter Mara, then with the death of John, I was rapidly losing my love and my unquestionable loyalty towards the British Army. Besides, I had completed 18 years' service, and this meant that I had secured part of my immediate pension. I had also now queried about my eligibility for redundancy, but unfortunately, as I was still not fully fit, I didn't qualify, as a medical discharge was the cheaper option for the Ministry of Defence. Part of me was still chasing my next promotion, and when it didn't come, I was defeated. I was done. Later that year, I recall going to see my commanding officer to discuss the reasons why I hadn't been promoted to the rank of warrant officer, and he was very direct and honest with his justification. He explained that I was his most capable and experienced colour sergeant, but he anticipated that I had no long-term future in the army. Therefore, he graded me lower than his less experienced but more physically capable colour sergeants. On hearing this, the adjutant's jaw dropped, as this went against British Army career policy, and the adjutant was still there to advise the commanding officer on legal matters. But I understood what the hidden message was. He had suggested that my career was over, and as my promotion was my only current motivational factor to stay in the army, maybe it was time to throw the towel in. I remember having mixed emotions after this interview, and, even to this day, I'm slightly conflicted. I had given everything I had, and now the fight was out of my hands, especially as I was due another medical review. The battalion doctor was aware that my recent spinal surgery had not been successful, and on my follow-up appointment the next week, I was completely truthful about how I had been struggling emotionally and physically. And just like that, my career in the Irish Guards and the British Army was over. I remember making my way through the barracks to clear out my office and being inundated with the normal recruiting and welfare questions. But I was in a haze and wasn't even listening. My life in the military had ended. I was no longer a soldier, and I now faced uncertainty regarding my physical well-being and financial future. All that was important to me now was my young family. Almost immediately, I was taken off the manning strength of the Irish Guards and placed into the Personal Recovery Unit, PRU, at Fulwood Barracks in Preston, and would remain there until my medical discharge the following year. Throughout my final year in the battalion, the Irish Guards had No. 2 Company deployed to Afghanistan, No. 4 Company had deployed to the Falklands, and the battalion as a whole were conducting their pre-deployment training for the Op Tosca 20, the United Nations peacekeeping mission in Cyprus. This was a 6-month holiday in the sun, where the soldiers patrolled on pushbikes with batons. The ever-increasing commitments of the battalion were always prioritised over the welfare of the soldiers, and this was made increasingly more difficult by redundancies and the restructuring of the regimental system, where all infantry battalions would be slimlined. The operational demands were still there, but with lesser manning, which resulted in very little time for welfare. One of the first to voluntarily accept redundancy was Soldier E. He was a very successful and popular member of the battalion and had reached warrant officer rank, with 5 years left to complete on his service. He was destined to be commissioned and extend his career. But after returning from Op Herrick 10 in 2009, his perception of military life altered due to his own personal experiences on the battlefield. Soldier E categorically believes that all military personnel who served on the ground in Helmand Province inevitably have some form of battlefield trauma. This was because of the ridiculous amount of IEDs that were hidden everywhere, and this meant that every step they took could potentially be their last. He then painfully explained how he witnessed soldiers picking up the pieces of their brethren, and sometimes unfortunate Afghan children, who were acceptable casualties at the hands of the Taliban. He states that observing such atrocities must have a detrimental effect on the human psyche. From my own personal experiences from Kosovo and Iraq, it was always the faces of the injured and dead children that haunted your dreams. The darker side of warfare that is never mentioned and is often brushed over. Soldier E recollects brave and battle-hardened men refusing to leave the safety of their armoured vehicles because they knew that the Taliban had planted IEDs in the area. Some of these grown men even pissed themselves out of fear, which is not in any way a stain on their character. These were all courageous men, and it was evident that they were suffering, but no support was ever made available, and this is part of the reason why Soldier E volunteered for redundancy. Like myself, he had observed how the British Army was failing to support the aftercare of its soldiers on return from arduous operational deployment, and went as far to use our self-certified assessments after the 2003 war in Iraq as an example of this. All methods of operational stress management were a formality, and only in place as an umbrella. Like many career soldiers of my generation, the futility of our time in Afghanistan broke our resolve and love of soldiering, and this could have been prevented with adequate aftercare, especially regarding our mental health. For the past 18 years, my loyalty to my regiment had been unwavering, and I'd given the British Army my all. But now I was beginning to question my loyalty, as it wasn't being reciprocated. However, the cost of austerity meant reducing the manning of our armed forces, and this subsequently affected all of the injured soldiers, as a medical discharge was more cost-effective to the Treasury than large redundancy payouts. Hence, all of the perceived dead weights, such as myself, would be shown the door in a callous, calculated gesture. Personally, I felt abandoned and rejected, but the methodical, institutionalized soldier in me accepted that this decision was part of the greater good for the combat efficiency of the British Army. One must remember that we are trained to be selfless, and putting the needs of the British Army before our own and those of my young family was righteous, hence justified. In reflection of my final years in the Irish Guards, one thing stands out, and that was the lack of commitment towards the welfare of the soldiers. Once I had completed the Unit Welfare Officers course, my eyes had finally been opened to how the British Army truly valued its personnel. Mission success and combat deployability were always the priority, and this came at the expense of the soldiers' individual welfare. The welfare team's only purpose was to maintain and increase combat efficiency, and this was achieved by working closely with the military medical staff. Together, regardless of the long-term implication, we would do whatever it took to keep the cogs of the military machine ticking over. During my time in the welfare office, I observed many failures, with the most significant being the lack of post-operational stress management, POSM. All of the deployment checks were completed, and the families were frequently updated whilst No. 2 Company was in Afghanistan. But the true failures occurred on return. The only mandatory check that was ever conducted was a POSM brief by the welfare officer, a few months after their homecoming. No individual POSM files or paperwork were recorded, and no follow-up individual aftercare or interviews were conducted by the soldiers' chain of command. Both Wade, who was the welfare officer on Op Herrick 13, and I agree that as a result of the high tempo and demands of battalion life, POSM aftercare of the individual would become a calculated sacrifice by senior commanders. POSM, in my experience, was yet another paper exercise that was paid lip service to. Even in 2021, a serving warrant officer in the British Army informed me that on entering a lecture theatre, he found a pile of signed POSM paperwork that another unit had just left there. It would appear that even today, the mental well-being of our soldiers and POSM is still an afterthought. This deeply saddens me, as I can only speculate on how many lives could have been saved, specifically veteran suicide, through proper post-operational stress management and adequate mental health support for my generation of warfighters.